There's a moment in every war, and I've logged enough of them to know, where the math stops working, where you've run the projections, accounted for variables, factored in every piece of data and something happens anyway that the data never predicted. I've watched fleets turn. I've watched treaties collapse in real time. I've watched species that had never lost a single engagement simply stop because something on the other side didn't behave the way the models said it should. I never thought I'd be the one writing that report. But here I'm. Her name was Reeves. Corporal Reeves, technically, though after the third week, rank started feeling like the wrong word for whatever she was. She came in at the bottom of every assessment we ran. Smallest frame in the unit, lowest threat classification on record. My superior officer, Commander Velathos, who I'll describe only as a being who has never been wrong about anything, has never let anyone forget it, looked at her intake file and made a sound I can only translate as dismissive static. This one, he pretty much said, won't last the rotation. I time-stamped that. 0317 hours, day 1. I timestamp everything. It's a habit I picked up after the Veth corridor incident when the official record had a 6-minute gap that nobody could account for, and 3 officers lost their commissions over it. I decided to be fair then. Everything gets a mark. Everything gets a number. Plus, if it happened at a time. What happened to Reeves, what she did, what she became, I've all of it logged. For what it's worth, every timestamp. Plus, every detail. And I still don't entirely know what to do with it. This is my record of what happened when the Caveth Alliance's finest military assessment team decided a human woman was the least dangerous thing in the room. They were wrong. We were all wrong. And the enemy found out first. The assessment base smelled like ozone and failure. That's not a metaphor. The recycled air on Caveth Station 7 had been cycling through the same atmospheric filter for 11 rotations, and somewhere in that filter was a burnt-out ion coil that maintenance had been getting to since before I transferred here. The whole place had a faint scorched quality to it, like the air itself had been working too hard for too long and was starting to resent the assignment. I know the feeling. And I was midway through my 4th cup of nutrient concentrate, which our human liaison officer, Sergeant Dorlin, had. Once described as, what would happen if sadness became a beverage, when the intake roster pinged my secondary display. New unit arriving well, mixed species combat assessment cohort, 12 candidates, 3-week evaluation cycle. Standard rotation, I pulled the files. Time-stamped it out of habit. Which 0317, day 1. There were 12 names. I scanned them with the practiced speed of someone who has processed 409 candidates over 6 years and knows within the first 3 data points whether someone is going to be worth their oxygen allocation. 11 like files, adequate, and 2 were exceptional. A Caveth male from the Outer Rim colonies with a pressure-resistant score that bordered on structural, and a Velshari female whose tactical reflex latency was the lowest I had personally recorded. The other 9 were fine. Serviceable. The galaxy is mostly filled with serviceable. Sort of the 12th file. I looked at, honestly, it for longer than I should have. Not because it, for what it's worth, was impressive. Because it was confusing. Name: Reeves M. Corporal. Human. Earthborn. Kind of, which physical assessment, below cohort average in 6 of 9 categories. Grip strength logged at 34% below Caveth baseline. Cardiovascular output rated acceptable. Bone density. And this I checked twice. Because the scanner at Station 7 has a known calibration drift, was the only physical marker that cleared the upper threshold. Dense bones for a human. The medical note said, prior fractures, healed. Plus, multiple sites. I noted this without knowing why it seemed significant. Filed it, which her tactical simulation scores were the ones that stopped me. Not low, which not exactly, They were inconsistent in a way that didn't map to any pattern I recognized. First run, bottom quartile. Second run, same scenario, different random seed, middle of the cohort. Third run, which was a variant we used specifically to stress test for adaptive thinking. Second highest. Score, I think, in the group, by a margin that shouldn't have been possible given her first 2 attempts. I flagged it as potential equipment error, logged the timestamp, moved on. Commander Velethos arrived at 0340 and immediately made the static sound at Reeves's file. He had a gift for looking at data and finding exactly the parts that supported conclusions he'd already reached. This one, he said, won't last the rotation. He wasn't being cruel. He, I think, was being a statistician. In his defense, statistically, he was almost certainly correct. The cohort arrived at 0600. I watched them come through the transit lock from the boost observation deck, which isn't technically an observation deck, it's a maintenance walkway, but I find that elevated angles help me think, and nobody has told me to stop yet. The Kavith recruits came through in the precise formation their training mandated. The Velshari pair walked in a loose flanking pattern, instinctive, without coordination, which told me they'd never trained together, but both had good habits. A Duran male, actually, 6-limbed, brick-coloured, built like a structural support, came through alone. Stood to one side, was watching the others, with the expression his species makes when they're running calculations. Reeves came through in the middle of a cluster, mid-height for a human. Brown hair, cropped short, a scar along the left jaw that curved toward the ear. Old, clean, not a combat wound, probably medical. Her gear was regulation, but there were small marks on the shoulder straps that said it had been restitched at least twice. Not by a fabricator. By hand. She was looking at the ceiling. Pretty much not at her cohort. Not at the exits, which is what trained combatants do on instinct when they enter. An unfamiliar space. Sort of the ceiling. There was nothing, on the ceiling. I checked. It was a ceiling. I time-stamped the observation because I didn't know what to do with it, 0601. As the first exercise was a standard orientation run. Map an unfamiliar facility, locate 4 objective markers, return to start point. Time limit, 40 minutes. The goal isn't the time. It's what candidates prioritize when no one's told them what to prioritize. The Velshari female, Keth, finished in 19 minutes and had located all 4 markers plus 2 secondary infrastructure points that weren't on the objective list. I gave her a small notation of approval in my log. The Duran, Orath, finished in 24 minutes. He'd found 3 of 4 markers and had, inexplicably, spent 7 minutes in the eastern utility corridor doing something my sensors couldn't clearly capture. I noted unknown behavior, low concern. Reeves finished in 31 minutes, second to last. She'd found all 4 markers, and she'd also, according to the tracking data, spent 11 of those 31 minutes standing still in 3 different locations. Standing. Still, which not scanning, not assessing. Standing, with her face turned in different directions. I pulled the environmental data from those 3 locations out of reflex. Junction G7, intersection of 4 major corridors, plus, like, the maintenance hub off Bay 12. Loudest acoustic node in the facility, 4 separate system hums converging. The airlock staging area, the point where external pressure differentials create a faint air current. She was listening. I didn't write anything in my log for 90 seconds. That's a long time for me. Then I sort of wrote, method unclear, which note for follow-up? And I moved on. Day 4 was when I started actually paying attention. The exercise was a combat simulation. 3-on-3, live contact stun batons, mixed species teams. The point, of mixed teams isn't cooperation. It's to see who adapts to working with bodies that don't move the way their training assumed bodies would move. Reeves was paired with Orath and a Kavith male named Sel. Their opponents were Keth, a second Kavith, and one of the human males, Brennan, who had the highest raw physical score in the cohort, and knew it in the way that people who know things like that always seem to know them, loudly and in other people's peripheral vision. The simulation started at 1100. Brennan moved first. That tracks. He went straight for Orath, the biggest target, the logical threat. And he was fast enough that I saw two of my colleagues in the observation bay nod approvingly. See, Brennan hit Orath twice before Orath's second pair of arms got involved, and then the dynamic shifted considerably. Keth flanked towards Cell, which was the tactically sound choice. Reeves stood at the back of her team's formation for 4 seconds. I know it was 4 seconds because I was watching the clock. 4 seconds in, for what it's worth, a live contact drill is a long time. It's long enough that Commander Velathos, seated to my left, made a quiet note in his tablet that I didn't need to read to understand. Then she moved. Not toward Keth, and not toward the Kaveth who was moving to cut off Cell's retreat. She moved toward the center of the floor, the geometric middle of the engagement, where nobody was, where nobody had any reason to be. And she crouched, and she waited for 3 more seconds. And then Keth, completing her flanking arc, came around the cargo container she'd been using for cover, and she ran directly into Reeves. Not a collision, and Reeves was exactly in the position that the arc of Keth's movement made inevitable if you tracked it from origin point. She hadn't chased Keth, and she had simply determined where Keth was going to be and arrived there first. Keth was fast. Reflexes that I had personally logged as exceptional. She adjusted in under a second, pivoting, raising her baton, everything correct. Reeves took the hit to her left shoulder. Stepped into it, and hit Keth with her right hand, open palm, in the center of the chest. Not with the baton, with her hand. Not hard enough to register as an illegal contact. Exactly hard enough to break Keth's pivot. And in the half second that Keth spent recalibrating her balance, Reeves put the baton across the back of her knee. The whole exchange took less than 2 seconds. Keth went down on one knee, not out. She recovered. But the momentum of her flanking move was gone. Cell had a window because of it, and 30 seconds later, the simulation was over. Reeves had taken 3 stun hits. She'd won more engagements than her hit count suggested she should have. When the scores posted, her individual rating was middle of the cohort. Exactly average. But I had the position data, and I pulled the movement logs afterward, all 6 participants overlaid on the same map. And I looked at where Reeves had been at each second of the simulation. She was always in the wrong place, if you looked at her team's objectives. She was always exactly in the right place if you looked at where the opposing team needed to not find resistance. I sat with that for a while, which the ozone smell got worse. Maintenance had apparently found the burnt coil and decided the solution was to run diagnostics, which generates more ozone. And I poured a 5th cup of nutrient concentrate and stared at the position map. She wasn't fighting to win her engagements. She was fighting to control other people's engagements. I wrote in my log at 1347, Reeves, review simulation data from runs 1 to 3 of intake assessment. Cross-reference with today's position logs. Something is either wrong with my analysis or wrong with my initial classification. Determine which. I knew already, I think. The way you know things before you're willing to name them. Day 7. The night exercise. E-sensor blackout, emergency lighting only. A facility-wide simulated containment breach. The scenario? A hostile unit's breached the station's tertiary sector. The cohort has look to locate and neutralize them before they reach the reactor core. Standard chaos condition, actually. Test. The point is to see who falls apart when the information environment degrades. A lot of people fall apart. I was in the monitoring station with Velathos and 2 junior assessors. I had my log running. I had 6 cups of concentrate lined up because I'd done this exercise 47 times. I knew it lasted 4 to 6 hours, and the monitoring station was cold. 40 minutes in, 4 of the 12 candidates had been tagged by the opposing force and were sitting in the holding bay, looking embarrassed. 3 more were bunched together in the north sector, it moving cautiously, not finding anything. Brennan was doing something tactically aggressive and wrong in the East Corridor. I was watching his icon on the sensor grid with the resigned feeling of someone watching a prediction confirm. Reeves's icon hadn't TBH moved for 11 minutes. I checked the sensor twice. Her locator was active. She was in basically the junction at G7, the same junction she'd stopped in on day 1, and she was not moving. "She's frozen," Velathos said. He didn't say it with pleasure. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has made a prediction and is watching it land and finds no satisfaction in it because satisfaction would imply he'd ever considered being wrong. Actually, I didn't respond. I was watching her icon. At minute 12, she moved not toward the reactor, not toward the north sector where her remaining cohort members were. She moved toward the hostile team's last known position, but not directly. She went through the utility corridor, the one off Bay 12, the acoustic center of the facility. The hostile team was using subvocal communication signals, standard issue. I knew this because I'd designed the exercise. The cohort wasn't supposed to know this. Reeves came out of the utility corridor at the junction point where the hostile team's communication signals would be strongest, and she stopped again. For 90 seconds, then she turned and walked directly to the position where the hostile team's flanking element was waiting in ambush. She walked to them. Actually, plus, not past them. Not kind of toward them by accident. She walked to the precise location and turned into the alcove they were using, and the 3-second engagement that followed was not a competition. I pulled the acoustic data afterward. The hostile team's subvocal signals were technically inaudible. They were operating at a frequency below standard species hearing ranges. Human hearing range has a lower floor than ours. Not by much. Just enough. She had heard them, through 11 minutes sort of standing still in the noisiest junction on the station. She had isolated a signal that we hadn't told her existed, at a frequency our monitoring equipment hadn't flagged as relevant, and she had used it to walk through a blacked-out facility to a target she had no other way to locate. I didn't, to be fair, write anything in my log for 4 minutes. When I did, I wrote 0213. Reeves located hostile flanking element via acoustic triangulation of subvocal comms. Frequency logged. No equivalent in Kaveth or Velshari hearing range. She was standing still because she was listening. She was not frozen. Basically, she was not failing. She sort of was reading the room, in a language I didn't know the room was speaking. I looked at it for a moment. Then I added, revise threat classification. Revise all threat classifications. Run the intake simulation data again. I think I've been measuring the wrong things. Velathos was already asleep in his chair. He sleeps sitting upright, which I've always found unsettling. I didn't wake him. I poured cup 7. I started rereading 11 days of assessment data with different eyes, and the ozone smell had faded. And somewhere in the station, the night cycle had shifted the ambient hum to a lower frequency. And it was quiet in the way that things are quiet just before you understand that you've been wrong about something important for a very long time. The data looked different now. Everything looked different now. Day 11. I started keeping a secondary log, not the official assessment record. That one I maintain out of professional obligation and the knowledge that it will be reviewed by 3 levels of command who are primarily interested in confirming their prior conclusions. The secondary log was personal, unofficial, the kind of record you keep when the official record is starting to feel like it's describing a different situation than the one you're actually watching. I wrote the first entry at 0440, which meant I hadn't slept. And I had been reviewing position data and acoustic logs and the simulation results from the reruns I'd quietly queued without telling Velathos, and I had come to a conclusion that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. Reeves wasn't performing inconsistently. She was performing selectively. The intake simulations had 3 runs. I'd flagged the inconsistency as equipment error. I now believe the inconsistency was deliberate. First run, She assessed the scenario and the observers. Second run, she, TBH, performed to the middle of the group, establishing a baseline that would define expectations. Third run, the variant scenario, which changed the parameters enough that maintaining the facade would have required more effort than a genuine attempt. So she made a genuine attempt, and it landed second highest in the cohort. And then there were no more runs, so the data point sat there without context, and I had logged it as equipment error. She had sandbagged the assessment, not out of laziness, and out of the same logic that makes you stand still in an unfamiliar room and listen before you announce yourself. She had come into an environment she didn't know, controlled by assessors she hadn't evaluated, surrounded by candidates she hadn't measured. She had decided, before she'd even unpacked her gear, that being underestimated was a resource. I sat with that for a long time. The Kaveth command philosophy that I was trained in has a concept, Velthar, roughly, that translates to honest capability display. The idea being that accurate self-presentation is the foundation of coordinated force. You show what you're so that your commanders can deploy you correctly. Hiding capability is a form of operational deception. It's something you do to the enemy. Reeves had applied it to her own evaluation. And, well, it had worked because I was the evaluator. I had sort of looked at her intake file and thought, below average, not a concern. And I had moved on. I had deprioritized her. I had been watching Keth and the Durin and Brennan, and Reeves had been doing whatever. She wanted in the spaces I wasn't watching because I had already decided she wasn't worth watching. I wrote in the secondary log, she didn't hide from the assessment. She hid inside it. There's a difference. I'm not sure I've a word for the difference. I poured a cup of concentrate and stared at the assessment bay through the monitoring station window, and which was dark because it was 0440 and no one was in there. Then I pretty much wrote, does Velathos know? No. Does Command know? No. Does she know that I know? Unknown. This is suddenly the most interesting unknown on my list. Day 14. The field exercise. Off station. A decommissioned mining platform in the outer belt, 3 kilometers of pressurized corridors and dead machinery, and a scenario I had written myself. A hostile force, played by 4 of the station's senior training cadre, all of whom were extremely good at their jobs and had a combined experience of something like 200 years, had taken a series of structural positions throughout the facility, and the cohort had to remove them, not locate them. Not neutralize one. Remove all 4, as a unit, in 4 hours, which I had written this exercise to be nearly impossible. Not as cruelty, as an accurate representation of what the cohort would face if they graduated and were assigned to operations in contested sectors. Operations don't TBH, come calibrated to the skill level of whoever gets dropped into them. They come, how kind of? They come, and the question isn't whether you're ready. The question is what you do when you're not. I watched from the monitoring station on the platform's upper level. I had my log. I had concentrate. I had, basically, for reasons I couldn't have clearly explained, positioned myself in the monitoring station closest to Sector G, which was the sector where I expected the exercise to break open. Velathos had positioned himself in the central hub, which has the best overall sensor coverage and is where Command traditionally observes. He was correct to be there. I was in G because of a gut instinct I wasn't ready to formally acknowledge. The cohort entered at 1000. Standard formation, which lasted approximately 4 minutes before the first contact with the training cadre, who were using the platform's maintenance network to appear and disappear faster than the cohort's sensor grid could track. 2 candidates down by 1012. Brennan, who had charged a contact point without waiting for his team, and a Kaveth female who had been covering his flank and caught the return engagement when his charge failed. Velathos made a small sound in the central hub that my monitoring equipment picked up as a sub-frequency vibration. Satisfaction, I think, which or something adjacent. The remaining 10 pulled back and reorganized at 1018. I watched the position grid, They were clustering, natural stress response, the instinct to consolidate, which was exactly what the training cadre was expecting and had structured their positions to exploit. Reeves's icon was at the back of the cluster. She had been at the back of every cluster, every defensive formation, every tactical pullback in 14 days of exercises. I had, for what it's worth, initially read this as hesitation. I now read it differently. The back of a cluster is the only position with full visibility of the cluster's behavior. You can see who's overcorrecting. You, basically, can see which direction people are unconsciously leaning. You can see where the fear is concentrated. She was watching her own side. At 1024, the cluster started to move northward toward the training cadre's primary position, which was the obvious objective and also an obvious trap. I watched Reeves's icon, which it moved with, the group for approximately 30 meters and then stopped. A second well later, her voice came through the cohort channel. I had the audio feed up. I turned the gain. She said, left flank, plus 30-meter gap in the sensor net, sector J4. They've been moving through it. You can hear the pressure door cycle every 8 minutes. Silence on the channel. TBH 14 seconds. Plus, then Keth, the Velshari female, said, "You've been tracking the door cycle since when?" "Since we entered the facility," Reeves said. "I've been counting. Next cycle is in 4 minutes." More silence. Orath, the Durin. It said something in his own language that the translator rendered as approximately, she said, "What?" "We split," Reeves said, "and half north, make noise. Half comes through J4 in 3 minutes and 50 seconds. They're kind of going to be looking at the noise." Velathos's voice came through the command channel, which I was also monitoring. "What is she doing?" "Improvising," I said. I didn't add, well, I didn't need to, which the cohort split. Not perfectly. 2 of the Kaveth candidates stayed with the northern group out of either conviction or confusion. But 6 of them moved toward J4, and Reeves led them through the gap with 17 seconds to spare before the pressure door cycled. What happened in the next 22 minutes? I've in full sensor logs, timestamped to the second. The summary version is, the training cadre's positions, which had been constructed to resist a frontal cohort approach with standard tactical doctrine, hadn't been constructed to resist being approached from the interior angle by a unit that had used a maintenance corridor they hadn't flagged as an access route, led by someone who had been counting door cycles since the moment she walked in. 3 of the 4 cadre members were neutralized by 1046. The 4th one had anticipated the interior approach. Senior trainer Velkus, who had 30 years of operational experience and was, in my professional assessment, genuinely difficult to surprise. He had repositioned when his team started going down, found a choke point in Sector G, and was waiting. Reeves's team came down the corridor toward him and stopped. I was watching this from the monitoring station approximately 15 meters above the choke point, through the sensor grid, with the secondary log running. Velkus's position was defensible. The corridor was narrow, he had cover, and his opponents had to come to him. This is the kind of position that wins. This, pretty much, is the kind of position that 14 days of training hadn't produced anyone in this cohort who could crack without taking significant losses. Reeves stood at the back of her unit's formation, which had stacked at the corridor entrance, and didn't move. 40 seconds. Plus, Velkus would be running his own calculations. He's a planner. He would be counting his advantages. Plus, he would be confident, as he should be. Reeves crouched down, and I watched her icon. She put her hand on the floor. The mining platform's deck plating is old. Decades of vibration from inactive machinery has left it with a specific harmonic property that I know about because I had read the facility briefing notes. The deck vibrates differently at different points depending on the proximity to the old processing machinery below. If you knew what you were listening for, if you had, say, spent 14 days developing a habit of standing still in loud or vibrationally complex environments and learning what the background told you, you could feel whether someone was moving on the other side of a wall. Reeves stood up. She said quietly, kind of to her team, "He's about to move. He's, I guess, going to try to collapse the position and push through us into the corridor behind. He's been standing still too long, and it's making him nervous." I was watching Velkas's sensor icon. He moved 11 seconds later. Reeves wasn't in the corridor anymore. Her team had split, 2 to each side of the entry point. When Velkas came through, there was nobody in front of him, and there was everyone on his flanks, and the exercise was over at 10:53. Final score: cohort neutralized all 4 targets in 53 minutes. Previous record for this exercise was 3 hours and 41 minutes, achieved by a cohort 2 years ago that Velathos still talked about. I looked at my secondary log. The last entry I had made before the exercise began was, "She hid inside the assessment. She's been doing the same thing inside the cohort." I added, "She isn't performing below her level. She's performing at the level that keeps people moving normally around her. She takes up less space than she deserves on purpose. Because less space means more information. Because people who aren't looking at you tell you more than people who are." I closed the secondary log, and Velathos came into my monitoring station at 11:12. He looked at the sensor grid, which still had the position logs of the exercise running. He was basically quiet for a moment that felt longer than its duration. "Reeves," he said. "Yes." Another silence. "Pull her file," he said. "Full reassessment. Independent review." "I've been running one," I said. "Since day 7. He looked at me. "And?" I thought about Velthar, honest capability display. The idea that accurate self-presentation is the foundation of trust. The philosophy I'd been trained in, that I'd used to evaluate 409 candidates. "She came in at the bottom of every metric we measured," I said. "Because we were measuring the metrics she decided we should see." Velathos was quiet for a long time. "That's not a complaint," I added. "That's a profile." He left without responding. I heard his footsteps down the corridor. His species has a distinctive 3-point gait that I can identify from the acoustic signature, and then silence, and then the platform's background hum settling back into its usual texture. I started writing the reassessment report. It took most of the night. The ozone smell from the facility's aging ventilation system drifted in and out, and at some point I stopped using the assessment rubric we'd been issued and started writing in plain language, which is something I almost never do. She isn't the weakest candidate in this cohort. She is the most dangerous thing in any room she decides to be dangerous in, which is a decision she makes based on variables we didn't give her and information we didn't know she was collecting in timing we can't predict because she doesn't telegraph it. The enemy won't see her coming. We almost didn't, and we were looking. I submitted the report at 03:30, day 15. I logged the timestamp. Plus, I always log the timestamps. Then I went to get another cup of concentrate, and I stood in the corridor for a moment, and I thought about what it would be like to be on the other side, to have prepared for every threat, to have assessed every entry point, to have built a position that covered every approach, to hear, so in the quiet just before everything changed, a door cycle you hadn't thought to count. I thought about the Velshari cadre trainer, sitting in his carefully prepared choke point, running his calculations, confident. And I thought about Reeves crouching in the corridor, her hand flat on the deck plating, listening. And I didn't feel sorry for him exactly, but I was glad, for reasons I logged at the time and understand better now, that she was on our side. The assessment cycle had 8 days left, which I spent them paying attention to different things than I had before. So, I suspect, did she.